Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. My name is Zishan Salahuddin, and I'm the Director for the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity at Tabadlab. Tabadlab is an advisory services firm and a policy think tank. Our topic for today is elections. The elections discourse dominates the airwaves in Pakistan at the moment. It is the topic of every discussion, debated in every socio-economic bracket. It permeates every other barrier that generally divides Pakistanis. And much has been said about whether or not elections will happen this year, what the delay for the provincial polls within the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province and the Punjab province really means for the democratic process, and whether an edge case in the constitution is going to be the reason for delaying general elections by an entire year. This policy roundtable will touch upon some of these elements, but they are not the focus of our conversation today. This Tabadlab Policy Roundtable, or TPR, is about the various risks and dangers that threaten elections, even if they were to be held on time. To weigh in on the issue, we have a very august gathering of journalists, election experts, policy advisors, specialists, and academics. Allow me to introduce them first. We have with us Mr. Ahmed Bilal Mehboob. Mr. Mehboob needs, frankly, no introduction. He is the founder and the president of the Pakistan Institute of Legislative Development and Transparency, or PILDAT, has close to 3 decades of experience in senior management and advisory positions, with experience in designing, planning, and implementation of a range of interventions and projects in the field of parliamentary development, strengthening democratic institutions, democratization, election monitoring, dialogues for reconciliation. I would, in fact, argue that Ahmed Bilal Sahab, if you would allow me the flattery, is perhaps the premier election expert in Pakistan at the moment. With us also today is my good friend, Ms. Arfa Noor, the former editor of the Herald and resident of Islamabad. She is a veteran journalist that has reported extensively on the elections, the political economy in the country, as well as the various political realities that shape our existence as Pakistanis, and currently hosts her own show on Dawn. Welcome, Arfa. Very, very, very happy to have you here, and very much looking forward to having this conversation with you. We also have with us Mr. Nazir Maher, who is the executive director of such institute. With over 36 years of experience, he has worked in democracy, rights, governance, public policy. His special focus has been on legislative strengthening, electoral reform, as well as human rights, in addition to mainstream governance in the social sector. Mr. Nazir Maher currently is also engaged with the European Union in Pakistan in looking at the election observation mission that they ran in 2018, their biggest observation mission ever. And whether or not the recommendations that came out of that observation missions have seen the light of day, if any of them have been implemented, and where the gaps still lie as we lead up to the elections. Welcome, Nazir. I'm very happy to have you here. And finally, we have Dr. Samin Mohsin Ali, an international development lecturer at the University of Birmingham in the International Development Department. Before this, she was an assistant professor at the Mushtaq Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. She is very well versed in the dynamics of bureaucratic reform, the implementation of an impact of a range of interventions and donor programs, and the intersection of party politics, citizen interests, as well as bureaucratic interests. She's published quite a bit of work on bureaucratic politics, and especially trying to understand the distribution of public goods, the success or failure of donor-led reforms, specifically the ups and downs of party politics, and in citizens' experience, whether or not state services are, for example, elections, are being implemented in the manner that they should be. Welcome, all 4 of you. Very happy to see all of these faces on my screen, and looking forward to a very, very robust and comprehensive conversation. So let's get started. Elections in Pakistan are never without controversy. You know, it is the principal position, I would argue, of this institution that the solution to the 5 major crises facing Pakistan, some of which are existential and some are approaching that categorization. The 5 crises, of course, being political, constitutional, economic, security, and that of climate change. that the solution to all of these problems are free and fair elections, with extra emphasis on the free and fair bit. And that needs to be demonstrably so. So let's start there. Assuming elections, be they provincial in the case of KP and Punjab, national, given the political climate in the country, the worst convergence of these aforementioned crises, and a very divided leadership, given the economic constraints, the security issues, the devastation brought about by climate change-related extreme events, are free and fair elections even possible? And I will direct this question first to my friend Arfan, and then to Ahmed bin Azad.
Thank you, Zishan. I think it's what do we mean perhaps by free and fair elections? In any society, and I think in any political system, we can always do with better elections, with fairer elections. That's true of the best in the West, and of course in the developing countries, the challenges are far more. If we talk about just Pakistan, I think we have a very difficult history of elections. There is great intervention, manipulation of election results. We've seen that more or less throughout the 90s and to a large extent post 2008 also. So they are not free and fair, perhaps by any stretch of the imagination, but I think what is the pattern that you do see in Pakistan is that every election result is contested by those who perhaps have not done as well as they had hoped for. But sometimes that contestation and the sort of intervention or manipulation of the election that you do see is far more, as we saw in 2018. It was far less in, say, 2013 or 2008. But it is contested nonetheless. There is always a political party which will point out that some form of manipulation took place. They will always raise questions about the legitimacy of the election and the parliament that comes out of it. But at the same time, they will always also become a part of that system. We, in Pakistan, I at least cannot remember any election where a political party that did not think it was fair, did not think it was, it wasn't rigged, and yet decided to boycott the parliament, decided not to take part in the parliamentary, activities that followed. So this is also, I think the pattern in Pakistan is very clear that the election is not seen to be fair by many, but everybody also legitimizes it by taking part in it. So that for me is a sign of hope. I suppose in Pakistan one is constantly looking for the silver linings. And for me, what it says is that, we have a very controversial electoral system, but it is not something that the political parties or the people have given up in. You keep hoping that it will get better. You do not turn your back on it. And that is what makes the entire exercise still legitimate, because at the end of the day, nobody is turning its back on it. And the intervention, of course, comes at various levels. But clearly, in recent years, or perhaps even in the 90s, what we did see was that it is basically the establishment's interventions which lead to some of the greatest manipulations and also the greatest contestation and the reactions to it. We saw this in 2018, and I think what is happening now is sort of still part of that same link.
Thank you, Arfan. And it's always nice to hear, some conversation that gives me a little bit of hope, because lately, I would say I've genuinely started feeling that we are now beginning to operate in an environment unlike anything we've ever seen before in this country. And there doesn't really seem to be any kind of quarter or silver lining, as you mentioned, to be found anywhere. We truly are neck deep in this, what the World Economic Forum calls the poly crisis. Ahmed Saab, your viewpoint on this, on the free and fair elections bit. Sir, your mic is muted.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Usually it's very difficult to disagree with the Arifa, uh, but one point I will slightly disagree with her is that participation in elections means legitimizing the electoral exercise. It's not necessarily legitimizing, because if you know, the people of this subcontinent had been participating in elections even during colonial periods when they very fiercely disagreed with the way elections were conducted, uh, like the limited franchise, like the restrictions on the elections. Still, they participated because they thought it provides them that window through which they can communicate, they can assert their claim to become free, to become, to ask for better elections and better, I think, rules of the game. So I think in Pakistan also it applies that people had been participating in election, people had been uh, going to the parliament, despite the fact they had very serious and genuine uh, complaints about the fairness of the election and fairness about the electoral process, because they thought they have no choice. They have to somehow find a way to communicate with people, to assert whatever they think is the definition of a free and fair election. So you had asked question in the beginning that do you think the elections, if they at all take place, will be free and fair? And I must admit that I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical, although I agree with the Arafa that in Pakistan generally elections had been generally perceived and in reality also had been not very free and fair. But the elections which we are going to hold in the near future, whether in May or in October, I'm very skeptical, even by Pakistani standard, that these elections are going to be free and fair. And I will not go into detail, but two quick reasons I will mention. The reasons are not new, they're very old. And I will be blunt in saying that in Pakistan, almost every election has been very tightly controlled and manipulated by the establishment. And in some elections, if you feel there had been less manipulation, that is because the result was expected to be same what the establishment expected. So they thought very little reason for manipulation or interference. But when they thought the result was going to be different from their own expectations of what they want them to be seen, then in that case the manipulation has gone very serious and very profound. And I think this time, given the state of relations between the party, which is at the moment probably the most popular political party, and the establishment, I do not see, number one, that elections are going to take place. And number two, if at all they take place, I am very skeptical, as I said earlier, that the elections will be free and fair. So this is something we have seen in the past 70 years, very consistently happening. And this time, probably it may happen even more fiercely. This is the first reason. And secondly, I think generally we see that people have very low level of trust in elections and they don't turn up to vote. And especially if I talk about youth, which forms about 46% of the total uh, electorate at the moment, they they are probably what we have seen over the past eight elections, that only 30% of the youth electorate has turned up to vote. So an election which is even fairer by other standards, where such a large number of people are not even turning up to vote, I don't think I can call that election free and fair. And the highest degree of polarization which we are experiencing, I've seen in 1977, there was a high degree of polarization. Uh, Now the polarization is even greater than it was in 1977. And we have seen what was the result of 1977 election and what led us to. So I think the chances of free and fair election in the current scenario, until something happens which cools down the temperature and which makes political parties to think and sit together and talk and decide about the rules of the game, I do not see. And one additional factor which has never been in Pakistan before, and this is my last point, is that we are having staggered elections. The chances are that the elections to the two provincial assemblies will be held on 14th of May. I don't know whether they will be held or not, but if they are held on 14th of May for only two provincial assemblies, there will be no caretaker government in the federation. And then if there are going to be elections in October, in rest of the provinces, provincial assemblies, and for the National Assembly, there will be no caretaker government in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and that will add another layer of possibility of rigging the election. So yes, I feel very pained to say that, but I will have to say that I find the possibility of free and fair election in Pakistan is very remote.
Thank you, Ahmed Saab, and thank you for your very blunt comments and your candor. And there, Arfa, I guess there you go. That's the yin to your hopeful yang, I suppose. We'll get back to that point in just a little bit. I do want to go to Dr. Samin as well as Nazir Maher Saab. I wanted to ask you a specific question, given your background, but given everything that Ahmed Mehboob Saab and Bilal Mehboob Saab has said, I guess I would also want to first get your comments on those. Because Nazir Saab, for you especially, considering the work that you're pursuing with the European Union, I guess that puts you in a strange spot, right? Because you're trying to implement all of these, or trying to see the implementation of all of the recommendations that came out of the election observation mission in 2018. You know, things that speak about equal access and participation of persons with disabilities, and voter education and registration, candidate registration, delimitations, electoral systems. But it seems like we might not even have the baseline here during these elections. So I guess my question to both of you is just further comment on the conversation that has happened so far. Nazir Saab, specifically with you, do you see any possibility of these reforms actually being implemented and where they currently stand? And for Dr. Samin, do you see the kind of bureaucratic changes that do need to be brought about, specifically in terms of the legal framework, electoral system, electoral administration, as well as the delimitation debate? I'll go with Nazir to go to Nazir Mazhar Saab first. Sir, your mic is off.
While I was saying largely I agree with my learned co-panelists, they have highlighted our relevant current points and the implications of the polarization and instability that we are witnessing. I would say there are certain things in big picture, in addition to the polarization that we are witnessing. There are significant representation gaps. 56% Pakistanis on average in last 8 elections have not voted. They are not part of electoral process. As Mahboob Saab rightly highlighted, this percentage goes to 70 in terms of young voters below the age of 30. 28% Pakistani electorate consists of voters from 18 to 29 years. 70% of this cohort of our population has not voted in last 8 elections. This is really very alarming. Certainly there is gender deficit as well, but youth deficit is far more alarming. On the other hand, ECP is far more empowered than in the past, particularly after 18th Constitutional Amendment and election law of 2017. They have more powers. And there is some improvement in terms of mechanisms and processes as well. Not some legislative reforms. Between 2018 and now, we don't have any significant legislation except for some back and forth on EVM and internet voting. There is one law pending. So when we actually assessed 30 EU recommendations Unfortunately, there is no progress worth mentioning, except for some administrative actions which address partly 5 of the recommendations. So there are huge gaps in terms of voter education, gender-related deficit. There are improvements as well, but there are gaps on political finance, voter education and mobilization. These are the areas, the significant ones, where there's a need to focus on. But somehow, after 2018 elections, political parties and institutions have not discussed electoral reforms the way it happened prior to 2013 or even 2008 elections. So we don't have electoral reform debate in Pakistan to address the issues. Certainly, there's a possibility of electoral violence in Pakistan, given the scale and frequency of terrorism that we are witnessing. And also, fillets is another issue, though, given my assessment, in case of Balochistan and Sindh, the example of local government elections, if it provides any guide for future, certainly problem is greatly resolved, not in terms of rehabilitation, but camps of affectees are located very close to their constituencies and polling stations. So certainly in terms of turnout, there may not be big issue. But there are other legislative administrative gaps that ECP and political parties have not taken up. And another area where probably ECP should be leading is electoral reforms in terms of providing guidance to parliament and stakeholders and playing a leadership role while engaging with external stakeholders like civil society, media. Unfortunately, that is not happening. So these are the few gaps that further complicate the upcoming scenario of elections.
Thank you, Nazir Saab. And you've touched upon the security point. I will get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but I'd like to go to Dr. Sabeen Mohsen Ali first.
Thank you, Zishan. So first, to loop back to the free and fair elections conversation, I mean, I think with great regret, I'm having to side with Bilal Saab on this, because I don't want to be so negative, but I think he's right that it's a very difficult environment in which to have free and fair elections. And even if you achieve what we would call procedurally free and fair elections, there are other fashions in which you might have a compromise process, which all parties may not agree with, or they may not agree with the results. It's good to have contestation, as Arfa said, and I think that's a big positive. But in the recent past, we've seen that kind of contestation take a very particular and very polarized direction, and that might be quite dangerous going forward. And we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about violence. But to return to your point about the bureaucracy, so of course, bureaucrats are just like everyone else. They also have their own political affiliations, which may or may not be stated. And so they are very aware of what the judiciary is saying, what the media is saying, what the politicians are saying, and they have their own allegiances, which don't play out in a very obvious fashion. So they may not declare them, or it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't work with certain people, but it does mean that they have a particular fashion in which they might implement or not implement certain reforms or carry out certain tasks. So bureaucrats are not neutral individuals in the way that, you know, sometimes the academic literature represents them. The other thing is, of course, that reform requires consensus at a political level first. The bureaucrats can only do that which they are told to do by a political administration. If there is, as Nazir Saab was just pointing out, if there's no discussion on reform, if there's no consensus or compromise, or no willingness to compromise on reform, and particularly on electoral reform, then nobody can do anything else. And just to take one example, for instance, one of the areas that does require reform is funding for political parties. And we've seen the case that was proceeding against the PTI. None of that has led to anything except political point scoring. So there's been no conversation about how can we change electoral law around funding in a particular direction to make it more transparent, to make it better regulated. Instead, what we've had is lots of people saying, well, oh, we told you so, that, you know, so-and-so was doing this and so-and-so was doing that. Part of this is also about the decline of the legislature as a space for debate, discussion, compromise in the last many years now, and actually dating back to perhaps the PPP was the last time that we saw a legislature in which debate was taking place. Even then, it wasn't great, but to some extent, around the 18th Amendment, there were conversations that were happening in the legislature. But during the Imran Khan years, certainly there was a departure from using the legislature as a space for discussion. And there are many, many reasons for that, which I won't get into right now. But the point is that when you don't use the legislature for that purpose, to bring all of the parties, opposition or otherwise, together to have a conversation around critical points like electoral reform, then there's nowhere to hold that compromise conversation. So all of it has to be back channeled, which, you know, that we hear these rumors that, oh, so-and-so is holding back channel talks with the different parties and so is trying to bring about a compromise. That's a very, very opaque way of doing it. And we don't actually know what that exchange is involved in those compromises. So I'm not particularly in favor of that. The final point I'll raise is about money. For bureaucrats to do their jobs and for them to implement reform or to do their jobs well, even without having to implement reform, whether it's election time or not, money is a big factor. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that elections are a very costly business. And even preparing for them, even the lead up to them incurs a lot of expenses. And we know that the ECP has been told by various parts of the government that, well, we don't have the money. And there are reasons why they don't have that money. But one of the things that I wanted to sort of connect the dots with in terms of the finances of elections is that this thing about not having funds, not having money, it also impacts bureaucratic motivation. So one of the things that we hear about over the last few months or the last year or so is that the government hasn't had salaries to pay various bureaucrats, typically foreign service folks who were posted abroad. So we hear these stories that their salaries were delayed, things like that. This affects bureaucratic motivation quite significantly. And bureaucrats are very well aware, of course, of financial crunches and things like that. So what is the bureaucratic motivation here for them to do their jobs well, to do their jobs properly, to deliver? Yes, we can say that they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, or they're doing it because they're mission motivated, or because they like their jobs. But at the end of the day, they also have families and they also need money. So not only does the government need money for the election itself, it also needs money to run its day-to-day business, to hire people, to pay their salaries and so on. And so from a bureaucratic perspective, this whole situation is even more dire. Actually, and I don't see a lot of hope here, because the day-to-day functioning of the government is also being compromised because of the poly crisis, as you put it.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. That was a very, very comprehensive analysis of the many issues that we are facing, particularly in terms of financing. I think that's actually a very, very important point, because it's something that has also been raised by the ECP as one of the barriers to holding free and fair elections. In fact, some of the conversations that I'm having also suggest that, as Ahmed Bilal Mahbousab said, having these staggered elections is actually going to end up costing the exchequers more money over the course of time, as opposed to holding the general and provincial elections together. Ahmed Bilal Mahbousab, I'll come to you in just a second, but before that, there's a point that Nazir Mahar Saab raised that I do want to cover, and I want to bring in Arfa once again, simply because a lifetime ago, when I used to be a journalist, this is an area that we have reported on extensively because of the turmoil and because of the pain that Pakistan went through at the hands of terrorist, militant, insurgent organizations, and still is. There's a massive resurgence of this. Security, of course, was also a very major issue in 2013. I remember I was working at a policy think tank at that point in time that used to specialize in security studies. And every day, there were suicide bombings. In an average year, there were somewhere north of 7,000 violence-related fatalities. And while the situation is not nearly as exacerbated at the moment as it was back then, there's certainly a big ramp up, especially since end of November last year, especially since the negotiations failed. of these attacks and these incidents. Now, these reasons, security reasons, have been cited by law enforcement, by the ECB as potential barriers to free and fair elections. And while the ingress of these organizations is not as pronounced, and I will say that with the caveat that despite Balochistan and KP suffering the brunt of the attacks, it remains a serious concern. In the past, former federal ministers, members of the National Assembly, political workers in general have been targeted and killed in terror campaigns. I guess my question, Arfa, is with everything that you've seen and everything that you report on and everything that you've uncovered, how prepared are we actually? Can we realistically manage these elections amid this re-emergent threat? And connected to this is, of course, the idea and the conversation about political militancy, something that Nazir Saab also briefly touched upon, and poll booth violence. Personally, given the level of political divides in the country, I can easily see polling sites turning into these skirmish, melee battlegrounds for supporters of various sides. What is our solution? Sorry, you're muted, Arfa.
Yeah. Zishan, I mean, the security situation is not very good, but frankly speaking, I mean, to talk about the security situation and link it to the elections, I find a little odd, because we all know that the only reason that the elections are not going to be held or are going to be delayed is because the result doesn't suit the military establishment, and because of the military establishment, the political parties which are think they're going to lose also don't want them to be held, and they the balance of power tilts in their favor. So this whole idea about the economic situation is terrible. There is no doubt about it. The security situation is not very good, but at the end of the day, these are not the reasons the elections will not be held. These are the reasons which will be used to justify why the elections will not be held or will be delayed. So, I mean, any conversation around them is fine. I mean, we can discuss it, we can talk about it, but really, at the end of the day, the election date, or when or if the elections are going to be held, is just going to come down to one factor at the moment. I'm not saying that things can deteriorate very rapidly in the future and the situation may change. If you have a default sort of a situation, I mean, an economist would be better sort of equipped to answer this question. But really, I mean, so whether it is the polarization, yes, there is great polarization. There is a financial crunch. There is a security situation. But these, at the end of the day, are the justifications for why the elections are not going to be held. The only reason the elections might not be held is because, as Ahmed Bilal Mehboob Sahab said, that the election result, at the moment, the way it appears to be, does not suit some players. And that's going to be the reason. The security situation was not just bad in 2013, it was terrible in 2008. We lost Benazir Bhutto. We delayed the elections for a month because of her assassination, but the election results still went on because at that time, even the military establishment wanted the elections to be held, and everybody was going to gain from it. This time around, we've turned it into this kind of it's like a win-lose situation, and the losing side doesn't want them to be held. Everything else is secondary. The polarization, the economic situation, the security situation. Part of the problem of what is happening in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and I learned this, I'm not an expert on either the security situation or the area, but from what my journalist friends tell me, we don't even have a security plan at the moment. Terrorism is increasing in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The military, the law enforcement agencies, whatever you want to call it, they haven't even, thought about how they want to counter it. That there was this big meeting that was held in Peshawar, where PTI was invited and it didn't go. Just look at the press release that came out of it. It told you nothing. This was not like APS. There was no plan. Balochistan, the situation is very different. But Balochistan, the problem is that since 2006, we've been facing an insurgency. And we're trying to use forced to put the insurgency down instead of trying any kind of a political process. The election will not fix it, but not holding the election is also not going to fix it, because we need a political process. So for me, I can be completely wrong, again, but none of this has anything to do with the election. Let's be very honest. They can all be. I mean, the major reason for why the election will be held or not be held has nothing to do with any of these factors.
Thank you, Arfa. And I think that's part of the reason that I've been bringing up all of these factors, because these are consistently cited by the ECP, by law enforcement agencies. Security is always cited as one of the reasons. Economics is cited as one of the reasons. One of the points that now seems to continuously come up is climate change, because that could lead to flooding. It could lead to lack of access. But as you suggested, and as you have said, a lot of this seems to be a smokescreen for what is effectively an entirely different reason for not going into elections, or at the very least, the elections not being free and fair. The outcomes is something that you touched upon, and I think that's a very important point that I would like to get into just a little bit more, if you'd allow me. If the elections were to happen, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. The outcome is not going to be accepted by the losing side. I think this is something that we are 100% agreed on, irrespective of the outcome of the election. Now, there have been multiple suggestions within even the EOM's report from 2018 about how to do, this kind of election dispute resolution, ensuring citizen observation. And I guess, Nazir Saab, I'll come to you next with the question of, do any of these reforms, do any of these recommendations, do they hold any kind of weight in terms of facilitating the free and fairness of it all? Or are we to just simply resign to the powers that be, the situation that we find ourselves in, and accept it for what it is? So, apologies, sir, microphone. The team, I think, just turns everyone's microphones on, so there's no peripheral audio.
Because I didn't turn it off, so I was not sure. So Arfa actually touched on something which relates to not formal rules of the game or reforms that we are talking about. There is something supra-institutional, which is really very important. So far as EU recommendations or recommendations of other observer groups are concerned, local observers have been talking about, is mainly about processes, mechanisms, even election dispute resolution within a very limited framework. The administrative dispute resolution where recounts need to be more streamlined, and the process of election tribunals, which is higher in hierarchy than ECP administrative resolution, should be defined in terms of timelines. That is something doable that we can do before the elections anytime. There is a very good reforms package in the form of Election Amendment Bill 2021. There are 49 electoral reforms. They address 15 of the recommendations of EU as well. And many people have written about those reforms and their efficacy. But if there is no agreement on broader rules of the game about certain actors intervening in the process before the elections or after the elections, because I would argue that election day manipulation has historically been minimum in Pakistan. It's very difficult to engineer a rig election day, except for 77 elections, but there too, I would say it was not as massive as it would have changed the results, the overall outcome of the elections. So it is pre-election and after the elections. If there is no agreement on those rules or the very culture of agreeing to certain things that we are not agreeing, unfortunately, probably electoral reforms in a very limited technical legal sense will not suffice, in my opinion. But if we touch on the issues relating to dispute resolution, there are huge problems. there are two constituencies from 2018 elections, Badin and Chinod, where there was issue relating to recounts, probably 500 votes or 1,000 votes. There was some marginal difference. Since ECP is not authorized to entertain petitions on recounts beyond 72 hours, those petitions have gone to election tribunals and they have not been decided as yet. So there is a need to come up with a law where at least ECP should be empowered on recounts and certain basic election-related disputes. And there should be time limits on tribunals as well. So election dispute resolution in a very formal sense too is an area where probably there is no development. So this is one of the missing areas which has not been taken up, in my opinion, even in electoral reform legislation that is pending with the parliament. So this is what I'm feeling on dispute resolution stuff. But there are certain other things as well where some good stuff have taken place, and ECP and its district and provincial offices are doing certain good things. We can talk about that whenever there is a question.
Sure. Thank you, Nazir Mahar Sahab. Dr. Samin Mohsin Ali and Ahmed Bilal Mehboob Sahab. Dr. Samin, you touched a little bit upon, the things that the bureaucratic setup has to do, how there are political pressures involved, and the impetus actually has to come from the political environment. The political environment, as you know, is as vitriolic and as divided as it has ever been. And we find ourselves at a juncture where, with everything that the four panelists have said, it does not seem likely, A, that elections might even be happening on time, or B, that at all they're going to be free and fair. I guess my question then becomes, because this is a policy roundtable, given that those in power are the ones that have the ability to actually implement any of these reformative policies or agendas, what are some of the options that are available to us? If we are to actually do anything to facilitate, to try and move towards, to educate the public about free and fair elections, are there any steps that we can take? This is the same question, it's perhaps asked in a slightly different manner that I asked of Nazir Mahar Sahab. And I guess it just boils down to, do we just resign ourselves to our fate?
I think that's the $1 million or rupee question, I guess. I think the problem, so my answer is, I guess, that these are structural problems. So we can't solve them in 5 weeks if we are going for the May 14th election or October. These are issues that are sort of part of the very structure of our parties. They're part of the way that we engage with the establishment. I do take Arfa's point that economy, terrorism, violence are all justifications that are used to forward whatever outcome the establishment happens to want at a particular time. But it's also circular in the sense that the establishment contributes to those factors as well. So for instance, to the economy, so much of our budget goes towards the military and towards servicing military expenditures that we don't have enough for everything else. I think that from the perspective of what I think there's two questions here. What is it that we can do, we being civil society or think tanks like the Tabadlab? And I think that there's lots that people are doing, which is sort of having events like this or doing various kinds of advocacy work. And that is basically a situation where you are stepping in to take over the role of the state, right? So you're stepping in because the state is not doing its job sufficiently to educate its people and advocate for elections or advocate for political participation. So I think the way forward from a civil society perspective is to think about alternatives, is to think about, if we are unhappy, especially if young people, as has been talked about, are unhappy enough with the mainstream parties so as to not vote, then what is required to mobilize those young people? Is it newer parties? Is it younger people in politics? I mean, look at most of our politicians, they are not young people. Very few of them are in their 30s. Most of them are much older than that. So at what level are we engaging with the youth to get them to actually come out and vote? So what alternatives are there? And there are sort of smaller leftist parties which are capitalizing on this in a small way so far, but maybe that is one space that needs to expand. From the perspective of the government, I think that the government of the day, and the PTI in its turn, and everybody else are so caught up in this polarized politics, vitriolic politics, and a revenge politics, right? You did this and now it's happening to you. Look, we told you and we told you so, and that kind of thing, right? Which is not conducive really to sitting together and figuring out what the next steps should be. If I were, I mean, in an ideal world scenario, if I were advising Shehbaz Sharif or if I was advising Imran Khan and they were listening to me, which is very unlikely, but if they were, I think the first step would be to look at things like internal party democracy. That's where you start. You start to look at how exactly your tickets are distributed. What is the process that goes into that? Where is your money coming from? What are the promises that you are making? What is your manifesto? Did you follow through on your previous manifestos? And that's something that citizens can also do and be more demanding, right? And that's a citizen education issue. That did the PTI or did the PMLN follow through on election promises that they made to you? A third thing is obviously to bring back local governments and keep them this time. The problem, of course, in all of these is that political parties are trying to eke space out with the establishment sort of hovering over them. And that brings us back to Arifa's point. Yes, the economy and money and violence and all of this are used as justifications for the establishment's interference, but the establishment has caused the problem to begin with. So, so the weakening of our political parties, the weakening of our civic culture is down in great part, not entirely, but in great part to military interference. And so clawing space back from that and establishing a relationship with the citizenry that is independent of that is, I think, really, really important and something that parties need to invest in, but they don't invest in membership. They don't invest in establishing links with local cadres. And in fact, for instance, in my the period in which I was doing most of my work in Pakistan was the Shehbaz Sharif government in 2013 to 18. They actually moved away from working with local cadres to favoring the more elite politicians and the engagement with center politicians, so federal politicians. So you end up with this preference for moving away from the politics of the everyday to the politics of sort of elite halls and the establishment. And I think that is a big mistake to make, but it's not something that any of them are going to fix anytime soon. So I think that really, unfortunately, the onus falls to citizens to sort of fill that gap, to civil society organizations to fill that gap. And unfortunately, that's also a space that has been hugely cut back on by the government, by the previous government, this government as well with PEMRA and the FIA and things like that. So unfortunately, it's not a very positive answer to your question, but there's lots that can be done. I just think that the will to do it and the ability and the space to do it, the time to do it is lacking.
Thank you, Dr. Sameer Ali. And don't worry, I'm increasingly getting used to not getting positive answers to my questions. That just seems to be the environment that we operate in. And you're absolutely right about the age factor. If we just look at the 4 or 5 top leadership in the country, Imran Khan is 71 years old or 70 years old. Shehbaz Sharif is 71, Nawaz is 73, Fazlur Rahman is 69, I believe. Asif Ali Zardari is 67. Meanwhile, the most quoted statistic, both by myself and our principal, Mr. Musharraf Zaidi, is that Pakistan's median population or median age is 23, which means 120 million of us are below that age, and the other half is above that age, which really tells you the disconnect that exists between the political elite, the political leadership, and the vast majority of the voting bodies in the country. And you're also right about, what you spoke about in response to Arfa's point about, yes, all of these are being used as reasons. One of the things that I am very afraid of is that in the process of just focusing on this particular issue, which is very pronounced, very real, and very dangerous, a lot of the other things will get sidelined in the process. Role of media, participation of women, equal access, participation of persons with disabilities, which, Nazir Saab, you can correct me, but I think that was actually also one of the points in the EOM 2018 report. Citizen observation, candidate registration, political parties and campaign environment, all of these issues that should be the debate in an electoral season will simply get sidelined and will no longer be, no longer matter. Emil Bilal Mehboob Saab, I'll come to you with that same question, the same question that I asked Dr. Samin Mohsin Ali. And I guess what I'm looking for is, it seems to me that any answer that is given so far is really for the long term and does not necessarily take into account anything that can be done in the immediate short to medium term, because we're really looking at, should elections happen at the national level, about 6 month cycle, that's it. So what are some of the things that could be done within the short to medium term to improve the situation?
I may have to repeat some of the things which I've said earlier, but I'm sorry for doing that. I will keep it to as brief as possible, the repetitive part. But the point is that all this talk of electoral reforms and improving the electoral process, improving the participation of this segment of population or that, they're all very important. But they're overshadowed by one big issue, which really changes the entire climate of elections. Until that thing is addressed, I don't think these reforms will really matter. In any case, a discussion of reforms is not very relevant at this time, because we do not have one of the largest political parties in the National Assembly at the moment. So we cannot debate properly, and we cannot develop that consensus which is needed for all legislation, but specifically for the electoral reforms. You need to have a good consensus, because you're talking about the level playing field. So number one, electoral reforms is probably at this time is not very relevant. What is at this time relevant and what is important long term? That is, again, that we should try to find a way that our establishment leaves the elections to politicians, to election commission, and to political parties, and to all the stakeholders, which are normally the stakeholders in an electoral process in a democracy. That is the most important thing. As long as that stays the way it was in the past 70 years, any amount of reforms, any legislation will really be useless. It will not do anything. We had been doing a lot of research on civil-military relations, and we have traveled to all those countries where military at one time was very dominant, like Turkey, like South Korea, like Indonesia, and try to find answers that how can that be addressed? How did they move back? And the lesson is that military has to be convinced itself. You cannot fight with them. You cannot push them back because they have the firepower. So I think best thing one should be able to do, and this is for the political parties to do more than anyone else, because we have National Security Committee, and these are the forums where they should be talking to them about it. Until they are ready to change the way they are conducting the elections or participating in elections, if I may use interfering in the elections, I think nothing is going to change. So that is the foremost thing which needs to be addressed. And if I talk about a few other things, I mean, yeah, I'm glad Simin talked about money in politics. I think money in politics in a big way influences the election outcome and the electoral process. And we have gone somewhat, I think we have regressed on that. We used to have a law in the Representation of People's Act, which stated that any person, if any person spends the money during the election on behalf of a candidate, that will be deemed to be spent by the candidate. We have changed this in Elections Act 2017, and we are saying that if somebody spends money on behalf of a candidate without the permission of the candidate, then that will not be counted as money spent by the candidate. This means we have given a big loophole to people to spend money beyond what is given as a limit in the Elections Act. So it means we have actually made this part ineffective. And then there is no limit on political parties spending. Political parties can spend as much as they want to, and now with the changing dynamics in the elections, most of the spending is going to political parties because they are the one who are doing centralized spending on advertisements, electronic media advertisement, on social media advertisement, on all these kind of things. And here political parties can spend as much they can. So therefore, political finance is one big area which needs attention. And even if we have got all these limits established in the law, Election Commission does not have the capacity to really look at the election returns which are submitted to the Election Commission. They do not have the capacity at all. And this is what has been borne out by the foreign or prohibited funding case against PTI and the case which is now going on against PMLN and PPP, that Election Commission doesn't have the capacity. And until we have that capacity and take this political finance things seriously, we cannot really hope of having free and fair election. But again, I'll go back. The main thing is that we should have the largest and the darkest shadow on the electoral process needs to be addressed, needs to be removed. Until that happens, we have seen that happening in 1988. We have seen that happening in 1990. There are proofs, there are evidence, they're written. They are. It doesn't really need to be proved what has happened in these two elections. This has happened in 2002, and this has happened in 2018. And we don't want this to be happening in 2023. And if we do not have free and fair election, we know that election provide a perfect trigger towards instability, like we have seen it happened in 1977 and in 1970. Elections are a very important thing. They should be held. But if they are not conducted rightly, they can be a trigger for a greater instability in the society.
Thank you, Amidst, once again for your candor. It seems any conversation that we have in this particular roundtable, it always leads back towards the looming shadow, the not so subtle manipulator and puppet master, the monster underneath the bed. And much as I would like to continue to ask the question of how do we actually stop this from happening and how do we remove this interference, I've been pointedly asking what can be done while being also fully aware of the fact that what we have been doing for the last 1 hour is actually what needs to be done. It's something that I think ARFA does on the airwaves every single day. It's something that Amidst, you do with your candor and your bluntness at Pildat and through your work. Nazir Saab has been at this forefront throughout his life, and now with the EU, and Dr. Sabeen in the classroom. So points well taken, Arfa, Amidst Saab, Dr. Sabeen, and Nazir Saab, about how the most important factor in order to facilitate free and fair elections and to ensure the survival of democracy as well as the survival of the political system in Pakistan is to ensure that this shadow, retracts. We've seen examples of this happening elsewhere in the world, Indonesia, of course, being the most salient one, where a decision was arrived at within the military establishment to just step away from public and political life. And you can see the results of that, a few decades later, where that country now stands. And the hope is that the policy conversation that I would say perhaps I wanted to have today is something that we can actually have, because the larger issue that looms over everything else would have been resolved and squared away by the time we have the next one of these conversations. I'll give the last word to my panelists, Arfa and Nazir. Just very quick thoughts on everything that Amidst Saab and Sabeen have said so far. If there's anything that you would like to add to that, and if there are, in addition to what we've discussed so far, any further solutions that you might have to continue to drive the conversation and to ensure that we move away from this interference model that has polluted our political environment for so long. Sorry, Mike.
Sorry. I can't, yeah. Sorry, I said very quickly because I also have to run. again, coming back to what Ahmed Saab said, this I agree with him that the only solution to this is for the military establishment to step back. This is there is no other way to it. But I would just disagree with him and say that this is really not something you can sort out by talking about it at the National Security Committee meeting, because the National Security Committee meeting is not a place where the politicians, the military ingress has now increased so much that I do not think that most of the politicians are even in the space or have the space to say back off. This has actually become, if you allow me to use the analogy or the parallel, and forgive me if somebody gets offended, this is the analogy between an abuser or perhaps the victim of domestic violence here. When you're getting beaten up, there really is no space to say, let's sit down and talk about it because you're beating the shit out of me and it can't be done. This is not the way to go about it. The end to this will come through some ugly ways, but I do not think it will come from a conversation. I hope I'm wrong. And I think what we have seen in Pakistan in this past year, the instability that we have seen, the sort of various strands of information coming in about the split in the judiciary, the split even in the lack of consensus within the establishment, is what might perhaps lead to this stepping away, where you realize that the cost of it has become too great for the institution itself. Then you will step away. This will not happen because the politician will sit down and convince you with an argument.
Thank you, Arfa. And Nazir Saab, very quickly, the final word. The mic issue. This entire roundtable, we've had the mic issue. Sorry.
I just forgot. Yes. The scenario that we are discussing today is undoubtedly very bleak, unprecedented in terms of polarization between political parties, as well as between and within the institutions. That has probably not happened in the past. But still, we have to find a way out. And initiative, in my opinion, either rests with the government or the establishment. They should come forward, and in a way, there is broader agreement, despite the polarization within political parties, on a role of extra constitutional forces and what should be the limits of military and other institutions in terms of their intervention or formulating the policies about the politics influencing the elections. So there is also room if some side, at least one side, takes the initiative and reach out to others. There is no other way out. It will continue as it is, and it can lead to other problems, greater instability, and God forbid, something even bad.
Thank you, Nazir Saab. I guess the one positive that I can take away from this conversation is that myself and all of the panelists are at least aligned on the basic issue. So, silver lining after all, Arfa. Thank you very much to my panelists for being here today and for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time and for being very, very candid with your opinions. This is precisely the kind of conversation that needs to happen across Pakistan. And perhaps if we hold enough of these conversations, some dent might be made somewhere. Thank you once again to Arfa, and Bilal Mahboob Saab, Nazir Mahar Saab, and Dr. Samin Mohsin Ali. This has been another Tabadlab Policy Roundtable, and we'll see you on the next one. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you.